We're here. Welcome to you all. We're here for Anna Schiffman's thesis defense. Let me tell you that I will immediately leave Hannah introduce her wonderful research, and we will all be listening. Then right afterwards, Catherine, you'll be invited to share your feedback with us, and then I'll let Martha also make commentaries or additions to Hannah's thesis, who's been followed so closely lately. So Hannah, please, the mic is all yours.
Hello, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I am so happy to be here today. Can everyone hear me really well?
Yes.
All right. Give me a thumbs. Yeah. Okay. Wonderful. I'll start sharing my presentation. Excellent. Well, thank you everyone for being here today. I am pleased to share my master's thesis today, titled Rembrandt and the Galleries Before and After the Findings of the Rembrandt Research Project. I would like to take this moment to thank Dr. Hollander, Dr. Scallon, and Dr. Camparelli for serving on my committee in each of your capacities. I'm relieved that this day has come, and it wouldn't have been possible without everyone's help. All right. I would like to share my love of Rembrandt and the Rembrandt Research Project came to me when I took a course my last semester at the University of Kansas with Dr. Linda Stone-Ferrier. As you may know, Rembrandt van Rijn is known as one of the greatest artists in the world. His innovative works stand out in art history for their realism, composition, and light and dark or chiaroscuro. With this introduction, I will now discuss my project. When you think of a Rembrandt painting, you may think of his subjects taken from life that reveal their humanism, realism, or perhaps you may think of his great ability to shape light and space and to capture a particular moment. For centuries, connoisseurs examined the painterly qualities of paintings to determine whether or not it was actually done by Rembrandt's hand. So even within Rembrandt's lifetime, attribution was a concern due in part to his pupils. Rembrandt had at least 20 pupils come through his Amsterdam studio. In this practice, it was expected that pupils copied the works and style of their master. Rembrandt would sign his pupils' works in approval for the market. Therefore, signatures are not as significant in the identification of authentic Rembrandt paintings. As a result, Rembrandt-esque paintings emerged during and after Rembrandt's lifetime. These are defined as paintings that closely resemble Rembrandt's painterly and stylistic qualities and techniques, in particular with chiaroscuro and subject portrayal. For example, which painting do you think is an authentic Rembrandt and which is not? The painting on the left is a Rembrandt, while the painting on the right is actually the result of an algorithm created after analyzing authentic Rembrandt paintings. Both paintings have Rembrandt painterly qualities that emphasize light, composition, and subject matter, but the object qualities of the left painting support Rembrandt attribution. 19th and 20th century connoisseurs were inconsistently and unsuccessfully organizing Rembrandt's painting into a catalogue raisonné, which is a comprehensive annotated listing of all the known works of an artist in a particular medium. Entries can include the title and title variations, dimension, size, date, medium, provenance, and a list of works attributed, lost, destroyed, and also fakes. Established in 1968, the Rembrandt Research Project, or RRP, was the modern response to centuries of Rembrandt connoisseurs in dispute of Rembrandt's painting oeuvre, or body of work. Their goal was simple: to produce an accurate catalogue raisonné of Rembrandt's attributed paintings. Decades later, though, this painting has been anything but simple. Across 40-plus years between 1968 and 2015, the RRP produced a catalogue raisonné of 6 volumes. In 2015, the RRP formally ended when Ernst von de Wetering retired. Today, their activities are continued by staff at the RKD, or the Netherlands Institute of Art History, through their Rembrandt database. My primary research question for this thesis is, how can the attribution findings of the RRP affect the labeling of Rembrandt and Rembrandt-esque paintings in museums? My thesis project will examine the effect and scope of findings from RRP's corpus in relation to public-facing information of museums through 3 case study institutions, and will evaluate transparency and accountability of all research activities between specialists and museums through wall text, object labels, and exhibition catalogs. My methodology is drawn from 4 sources. First, the RRP's corpus. I chose to treat these 6 volumes as a primary source, even though they are technically a secondary source. And second, I would like to focus on my 3 case study museums are their object labels and wall text for the individual paintings I chose to examine. Third, the museum's archives are accessible either online or in physical dossiers. And last, exhibition catalogs that include my case study paintings. In chapters 1, 2, and 3, I am focused on 3 particular international museums for my case studies, which are the National Gallery in London, the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., and the Marist House in The Hague, Netherlands. All of these 9 paintings were selected after examining each museum's collection of Rembrandt and Rembrandt-esque paintings. Each painting has a history of differing attributions between Rembrandt scholars and professionals at each museum. By choosing 3 museums from 3 different countries, there was an opportunity to study international similarities and differences in attribution. At the National Gallery of London, I am focusing on Portrait of Frederick Reichel on horseback, An Old Man in an Armchair, and Anna and the Blind Poet. At the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., I am focusing on Lucretia, A Woman Holding a Pink, and The Mill. And lastly, at Marist House, I'm focusing on Portrait of Rembrandt with a Gorget, Saul and David, Portrait of an Old Man. My findings are the following. The RRP and their corpus has been the most proficient and detailed source of Rembrandt attribution to date, and those involved with it are considered the experts. A great deal of funding and resources had been dedicated to the RRP. In the early 1990s, the public grew skeptical of the RRP, particularly with the criticism of the exhibition Rembrandt, the Master and His Workshop that was held in Berlin, Amsterdam, and London. The show failed to determine pupil attributions prior to the opening. As a result, the 4 eldest members of the group collectively retired. The youngest member, Ernst von de Wetering, reshaped the methodology and approach of the RRP going forward. The new RRP's decisions were shaped by considering both technical examinations and visual analyses. However, the RRP's intentions were never to serve as an authority figure of Rembrandt attribution, rather providers of information, arguments, and personal opinions. With this thesis project, when I analyzed the labels and public-facing information at each institution, I established a trend of attribution inconsistencies between the host institution and the RRP's work. It is difficult to point towards a system that best fits the challenges of organizing all of Rembrandt and Rembrandt-esque paintings. However, following these 9 case studies across 3 museums, the process of implementing institutional change involving painting attribution is not a linear process per se. I argue that this solution will result in a decision through the collaboration between the RRP and host institution. Each object is and should be handled differently on a case-by-case basis, even within the same institution. And the space capacity and in-gallery experience of object label and wall text should not deter the museum from expanding the scholarship of paintings with questionable attribution. Instead, this information should all be provided in an additional interpretive tools such as audio guides or the museum's website. The National Gallery of Art's online entries for Rembrandt paintings are a great example. Each painting's catalog entry details its technical summary, comparative figures, provenance, exhibition history, and bibliography. I chose not to focus on the cultural and/or monetary gains and losses that result from Rembrandt attribution and disattribution of paintings. And I also excluded private collections due to their lack of accessibility and breadth of resources. Moving forward, I hope that this thesis project should spark a new conversation at museum institutions that hold collections with paintings of questionable attribution. A conversation framed on the principle of transparency for their audiences via object labels, wall text, online descriptions, rather than presenting complete certainty with incredible other parties that may say otherwise. As shared in my first chapter, in the case of Anna and the Blind Tobit, the painting was deemed a Rembrandt only after being shown alongside other Rembrandts. However, when the National Gallery chose to exclude Old Man in an Armchair from their exhibition, Rembrandt, the late works held in 2014 and 15, the institution was depriving their audience from a questionable attributed painting. This project can also serve as a tool to initiate or supplement a practice of accountability for collections and ownership of paintings with questionable attribution, as well as an attempt to increase educational access to all audiences. Museums and private collections should consider the greater transparency with the public by increasing access to the process of curatorial decisions, particularly with objects of questionable attribution. The RRP is an excellent example of engaging museums in having conversations about attribution. This will in turn encourage museums to be more transparent with their local and global communities. By introducing these stakeholders to the museums, the needs of systemic change museums will inevitably implement in the future. By beginning these types of changes within a museum's existing collections, a museum can be significantly more prepared to encounter future high-risk opportunities that the institution will be called upon. I anticipate these changes certainly within my lifetime and look forward to the future. And I'd like to finish on a quote by Ernst. If it resembles a painting that's positively by Rembrandt, then it's probably by him.
That's interesting. Thank you, Hannah.
Yeah.
Very nice. Thank you. Catherine, would you like to share your feedbacks with us?
Absolutely. And I love this quote from Ernst von de Wetering, and I'm going to go back to that in just a second, Hannah. First, I want to preface by saying how much I admired your thesis for both your ambition and your bravery. You took two very difficult, thorny subjects, Rembrandt attribution, and the question of what a museum owes to its various audiences in the information it presents to the public. And putting them together, that's quite a challenge in particular, and a very worthwhile one that you took up. And I want to say that I learned from yours, especially the disparity at the National Gallery of Art between their object labels as opposed to Arthur Wheelock's catalog. I really had no knowledge of previously, and I thought that was a pretty bad situation. So what I would like to do, I think, is start with one or two general questions. Then I'm going to do a very, very quick run through of a couple of things that I think could be corrected in your thesis, minor things. And I can write I haven't written down, I can send you the list, you and Martha, the list as well. Okay. But just to run through those. And then I'm going to do a big devil's advocate question for you at the end. All right. Okay. So that's just how I'm going to approach this. So the first question I have then is, what of these three museums, which museum do you think at this moment is doing it best?
From all of the resources that I've gathered, I would argue that from the holistic experience of visiting the museum and as well as its tools, I would argue actually that the National Gallery in London is best representing both the museum, supporting the museum's audiences, as well as a collaboration between perhaps like partnerships like myself, scholars, or just the casual visitor that is there, typically tourists. Because they do have the tombstone or the basic information labels on every object in the collection, but they also have the selective expanded wall labels, whereas the National Gallery of Art in DC, they only have the basic labels with basic information. And the Moritz House, they do provide a case similar to the National Gallery in London. However, online, they provide no additional information. Whereas in the case of actually Rembrandt's, they do have like a paragraph or so of information, but it's very art historical. It's examining the painting itself, where instead of considering its entire history of the object itself. So, yes, the National Gallery.
Okay, good. I mean, that makes perfect sense to me. And I've always felt that they are a very good museum for trying to bring scholarship forward, including technical art history, which I really commend them for as well in some of their information. When I come back to the big devil's advocate question, I'm going to warn you what it is in advance. It's going to be about curatorial discretion and what is the role of the curator versus, again, educational departments in the museum, and then the whole question of curators versus RRP. So I'll come back to that in just a couple minutes. Okay. So we're going to fly through some things really quickly because most of them are really minor. Okay, and I want to commend you on that. I've certainly read doctoral dissertations where I had far more suggestions for corrections to make. So you've done a really good job. Okay, page 14. You're talking about my guy Boda. His catalog actually wasn't chronological. Vosmar is the first chronological catalog.
Okay.
And why you may have made that is that Boda's discussion is chronological. He goes through the periods of the life and talks about the works in that way. But when he gets to the actual catalog, he says, chronological doesn't work yet, too complicated, I'm just doing it by location. As you know, he will certainly do it later, but I think it's important to get that straight. Also, the same page, 14, at this point you talk about Bartsch doing the first catalog raisonné of a single medium of artist, and actually you had said a couple pages earlier correctly, it was Gerson, not Bartsch, who first did that. So that's a sentence that just came out.
Okay.
Page 28. When you're talking about the Frederick Reichel painting, which is fascinating, of course, for that palimpsest, but on this page, you kind of indicate two different things on the same page, whether the National Gallery says it's all Rembrandt or whether it's Rembrandt and Studio, about a paragraph apart. And that just needs to be, a decision needs to be made as to which one you're going with there. Or at least to clarify. As I said, I don't have the specific sentence. You'll find that out. Page 31, also still on the Reichel discussion. And you're bringing in the Polish writer. The reason they can say this about Reichel versus the Polish writer was not a commissioned portrait. It may be a commissioned painting, but it is very definitely not a portrait. Okay, in a sense, it may be a big trony, or it may be a narrative painting. We really don't know, but I think it is a very different kind of painting. Now we're jumping up 30 pages. See, everything's perfect, going great along. Pages 62 into 63, two issues there, talking about the mill. Here's the interesting thing. You say that the questioning by Seidlitz of the mill's authenticity led to downfall in its public popularity. That's not really true. It led to a downfall in the scholarly reception, but it remained an incredibly popular painting. And when it went into the National Gallery of Art, it was a big deal. So I think just to kind of clarify the difference between public reception and I think that's an interesting one in this case, in scholarly reception. Following up on that, on page 63, you're talking about people like Steckow and Rosenberg, who accepted the equation of the life and the art in Rembrandt, and how that, yes, of course, became a kind of antiquated approach. Now we're a lot more cautious about equating the life and the art. But you throw in Cynthia Schneider and Arthur Wheelock in that group, and I don't think that's really appropriate. I don't think that either Schneider or Wheelock was the same as, say, Steckow and Rosenberg in that way. Small thing, but I think that that's something that they would wonder about. So So those are my little things.
Okay.
We're going on still. Sorry, back up one page. This is about adding a sentence, I think. When you're talking on page 57 now, so sorry, going back a couple of pages, we're talking about the woman in a pink, which was a really fascinating discussion, more than I'd ever read about it. So that was really interesting for me. I think it would be helpful just to add one sentence to account for what in the cleaning changed Wheelock's mind. You say that that's what changed his mind, but I think it would be helpful in that discussion because, as you see, he's just going to not even deal in the catalog with the fact of who, doesn't accept it at that moment. He's basically just going to say, I accept it for this reason. So I thought that would be a very, very useful thing to add in.
Definitely. Okay.
All right. Now I'm going to quote from you.
Okay.
Now we're getting into my devil's advocate question or so. On page 47, you have a very good sentence about it is a loss for all participants. I'm misreading because I can't read my own writing, but talking about excluding opportunities of museums in and out of the galleries to bring forth information about these decisions on attribution. And this is the million-dollar question. How do you do this? So, for instance, in 2012, there was a wonderful exhibition called Rembrandt in America, where it was in Cleveland, Minneapolis, and Raleigh. And what they did in Cleveland was have this huge circle on the wall. And at the center of the circle, the bullseye is Rembrandt. And then they have a circle around that saying workshop. And then they have a circle around that saying attributed to. And then they have a circle around that saying circle of Rembrandt. I mean, you see what I'm saying? They're going further and further. It was a wonderful graphic demonstration of closeness to Rembrandt and how thorny it is. And you're well aware by now that Rembrandt is probably the thorniest problem out there for painting attribution because of lack of signatures, as you said, provenance, all the rest of, no documents, all the rest of it. But then how do we do it? How do we do it? So that's question number one for you of the big question. You rightfully say you have to coordinate your object labels with what you have on the web. As we know, that may even be the tug of different departments, education and interpretation versus curatorial versus, even digital communication departments. How do we coordinate those? What do you think at this point, having observed these three museums, what would you like to see if you went into a Rembrandt gallery in 5 years in those museums? How would you like to see things differently done there?
Yeah. As I slightly suggested that we include just having an inclusion of descriptive or suggestive labels where I'm assuming it's the curators that are making these decisions and the educators are disseminating the information, that it's just simply starting with not excluding information. I think it's just simply, I would say that I would pull the example of the Frederick Reichel. It has no information pertaining to the finding in 2008 of on the back of the painting a different image of a man, and they found that image only 2008. So it's just a matter of excluding pertinent information that like discoveries or newsworthy titles, because I only found a couple of different news articles about different subjects that be worth noting in the museum. But when a museum says that something is certainly Rembrandt, there's no doubt whatsoever. By putting a question mark whatsoever, excluding that, it says a lot, especially if there are other scholars in the past whatsoever have deemed it questionable, unless there's extensive study to the point of Saul and David, where there's years and years of technical information, and then also disseminating it with the public. When they finished the restoration and the research with Saul and David, they put on an exhibition detailing all of those aspects, every nitty-gritty detail you could think of. They put that on display for the public. Whether they understood or not, there's a level of appreciation to that. So, but you also have to meet museums where they are. So somewhere in between that and the level of detail that maybe audiences are not ready for or looking forward to quite yet. I would personally, as a museum goer, art historian, I'm interested in that. Not the public per se. We don't know unless we ask. So that's what I aspire to in the future regarding transparency.
Okay, good. And so here's my last devil's advocate question. Van de Wetering, you had that wonderful quote from him. And that, I think, quotation about if it resembles very much one, it probably is by him, has to do with how we define what a Rembrandt is.
Yes.
And his article that you cite, this very important article on whether the search for authenticity is an anachronism, which I think it very much is. I mean, these are all Rembrandts pretty much, according to the 17th century. And I think Rembrandt would have claimed every single one of the paintings that you sponsored, and you picked great case studies. I want to say that too. He would have claimed every one of those, said, yes, that's a Rembrandt. You know, it's my style, my kind of ideas, my workshop, you know. So given that, that it still is the issue of, are we trying to impose too much late 20th and 21st century standards of authenticity on earlier periods in a way that is anachronistic? Shouldn't we allow for more curatorial discretion, therefore, too? So if Arthur Wheelock chooses not to always reference the Rembrandt Research Project, is that bad necessarily? And I mention that because I think of exhibitions that came out in the late 1980s and 1990s that were definitely responses to the Rembrandt Research Project. So not Rembrandt the Master in his workshop, because that actually is an RRP production, more or less. But Art in the Making in London at the National Gallery, which challenged them, but actually forced them to do deeper technical studies of their own paintings, which turned up some very interesting things. Or Rembrandt, not Rembrandt, at the Metropolitan Museum in 1995. You know, in some ways, one of the greatest contributions of the Rembrandt Research Project was to push these museums and say, okay, we don't really accept what you have to say entirely. So you could say, in a sense, okay, I could see one of these museums saying, let's say London, say, okay, we took care of that. We dealt with the RRP. We did it 30 years ago already. We've incorporated what we need to, we've rejected, but I don't have to keep referring to them now. If I'm the curator there, I can just write a label and talk about it's been questioned in the past, the authenticity, but this is why we believe it is or isn't. Is that wrong? Is that wrong for them to not necessarily always, for instance, refer to the RRP, or is that part of their curatorial discretion?
Good question.
That's why I said it's a devil's advocate question,
yes.
because it's not or a clear-cut one. Yes. Yeah. I'm just curious to know what you think.
Yeah. No, I would agree that it's not what probably the original intentions of, or the attitude of the RRP intentionally was, to stoke the fire of museums and make all these controversial decisions. And they did that, but Ernst kind of flipped it on its head, and he knows the power he wields in his decisions, and he knows what, like, his influence. So I I would argue that it's not wrong, because as a curator, you have the discretion to make these decisions. That's why you're the curator. You come in, and as long as you are aware and you are considering all of these outside parties as the RRP, and you're factoring that into how you're planning exhibitions, how you're planning the new set of acquisitions, how you're planning every aspect of the in-gallery experience, as long as that's in consideration, I would argue that if the curator is aware and the staff want this outcome, they can pursue that in terms of what, it's at their discretion. It's in their collection. They own the painting. It's a little bit fuzzier with the National Gallery in London, but it's up to their discretion. So I would argue that it is a positive outcome, such as the RRP, that are coming in, making that have made these decisions, and have, again, they disclose, they're not the experts. They know that they have the resources and the tools to make these claims, but it's up to the museum itself.
That's a very fair answer. Thank you, Hannah. I turn it over to Martha.
Please, Martha, share with us your comment.
First of all, Hannah, what Catherine said. So everything that Catherine has already said, I'll sort of say again in a much briefer way, which is to talk about the great ambition of what you have tried to do, and in many ways you have succeeded in doing. It's enormously ambitious, and it's really important. And everything that Catherine has been saying about the specifics about museums and about curatorial discretion and all of this, all I can think about is how remarkably timely this thesis is, because museum culture is exploding. Even as we sit here and talk, as we all know, and it's very, very exciting and long overdue. And in some ways, a lot of, this thesis is a kind of is a case study in itself of how museums can move forward and better serve their rapidly changing audiences and rapidly changing expectations about what museums ought to be doing. This is really huge. And, you and I have talked about this. I kept telling you, didn't you see, oh God, I'm sorry. Oh, so sorry. My brain. I can't remember words, excuse me. All right, forget I just said that. I'm sorry. I wanted to say something and I can't remember. Forgive me. This is one of those moments. But oh yeah. The museum scene in Black Panther, which I make my I think about. I mean, that's just something which, bringing the issue of museums and what they are for into public consciousness. That's why I wanted to mention that. In general, this is a really good piece of work, and it's true that it's very brave. I also really liked the case studies as examples, which I don't think I ever got around to telling you because I was too busy saying, could you please clarify that? Which was my favorite thing that I said every minute, and which I will continue to say. I lack Catherine's specific expertise about these all of these different exhibits, not all of which, alas, I was able to see, and the wonderful backstories behind all that. So what I am just focusing on here is it's great as a presentation of research. the amount of work that you have done, particularly given the disruptions that you have had, not just all of our disruptions, but the particular disruptions that you have had in getting this thing done and managing to complete it under quite remarkably difficult circumstances, if not, surreal circumstances, is really, really, really to be commended. What I would say, looking forward, is that the only real, aside from sort of general, going through one more time and sort of just cleaning it up as a piece of writing, what I would say going forward is that these issues that Catherine has raised, that are essentially you yourself have already raised about not just the responsibility of museums, but the complexity of how to execute those responsibilities within the institutional structure, how much communication there is between the education area, the curatorial area, the folks who actually go and do the digital issues. And I just want to parent that, this is very complicated. Your job, I think, in this particular piece of writing would not have to be to unpack all of that, because you have no access to that information. It is probably best kept a trade secret, because that opens a whole other can of worms. And I just want to say parenthetically, I mentioned this to you, but maybe the others here would like to hear this, that I learned from somebody who worked on the Metropolitan Museum's website. It turns out that a lot of stuff there's a lot of peculiar inconsistency, sometimes redundancy, but sometimes just weird inconsistency between stuff that you see about an individual work when you go to the timeline, the Heilbronn timeline, and stuff you see on the website for a particular work, and then some of these are in a digital catalog. And so there is a lot of inconsistency. And I mentioned this parenthetically to this person I met at this hackathon event, where, by the way, we created a digital tombstone. It's just something I want to mention. I think that's the way the future is, to create digital labels, so you can say, click here, click here, click here. If you want to know more about this debate, click here, or you don't have to. Anyway, he was the one who told me that that it was a mess, and that what was going on in terms of information on the website was not, in fact, being well coordinated. And this is the kind of trade secret you don't want people to know. But I said, this is interesting because just as a user, not even as a scholar and as an educator, just as a user, I couldn't figure out what was going on. Why do some pieces have enormously long and complex and fantastically rich sources of information about them, and others do not when you go online? So anyway, I'm just saying this is a sort of long-winded detour, but it actually does strike in some ways to the heart of it, which is that this thesis opens up this great can of worms in a good way. And that one thing that you can do, I think I was thinking of this as Catherine was talking about all this, is these issues about roles within the institution, also the very complex interplay, not just among them, but also in terms of what exactly do you owe the public in a given context, at a given time, and also having to deal with all sorts of other issues like space, like budget, like, what exactly do we want to do with this, and all kinds of other, not to mention, internal politics and all of that tiresome stuff, which is very important because of its effects. All of these, I think, in some ways should be, what is the word I want? Should be sort of mentioned in a way, in a conclusion. Because one of the things that I think you don't you have not quite done, and this has to do with its execution, not with what you want to say, but how you've said, is at the end to say very clearly, here are all these big issues that I am not going to deal with. I can't here because of reasons of space, because this could easily be a dissertation. And okay, don't be scared. You don't have to write it. There is a dissertation in here because I kept thinking, oh, you know, this needs to be looked at and that needs to be looked at, and you can't. And this is absolutely no criticism of you, any limitations you have as a scholar. It's just not the venue for that. This is a master's thesis, but it is, which is a kind of, you know, warm up in some ways. But because this is in museum studies, you're an art historian, and this is a dissertation in museum studies. And so a lot of these issues about what do museums owe their rapidly changing and varied audiences regarding this very, this thing that has a lot of impact, but which a lot of people don't even think to ask about, you know. This issue about the institutional implications of all of this, that is something that you should mention.
Okay.
Which in some ways is a rhetorical thing that everybody does at the end of their projects, their books, their theses, their whatever, their articles, which is to say, okay, here are the implications of what I've just been talking about here. 1, 2, 3. I'm not dealing with them now, but here is what they are for further research, you know, onward and upward. But I do think it's important, not just as a rhetorical strategy in terms of writing, because I was waiting for that at the end, and it wasn't there. And that is something I think that you could do. And this is not rewriting anything. You please don't be terrified. I know what a short time you have to get this thing filed. But you know, if you could write a little something that incorporates the issues that Catherine was mentioning, I think that would be really good, because you know that they're there, but we have to know as readers of your work that you know that they're there. And the only way you're going to do that is to say so. So I think that is mostly what I would say. All the other issues you know all too well, and you've been very stoic and very responsive and very reactive, as I have said throughout. Clarify, clarify, clarify. Could you please say that again? Could you please say that again? Could you please say that in a clearer way? And these are, to me, these are not. These have nothing to do with what you have set out to do, with the value of the work that you have done. This really is about the execution of the expression of your ideas to best effect. And so really, you know, I'll talk to you later. I know that Catherine is going to have a little list for you, which is great. And I will talk to you later on. We can communicate any way you want, because essentially that's really what is involved here, which is just cleaning it up a little bit to the extent that one can possibly do in such an impossibly short time, but also to just say at the end, yeah, this is what all this is about in the grander scheme. Yes, we get this, we know this, and we're not going to do it here, but this is what needs to be addressed. You see what I mean? So I think that's important, particularly since this is in the area, this relatively new area, reinventing itself as it goes along, of museum studies.
Thank you, Martha.
Sure.
And let me say that it's no mystery I'm not an expert in the field at all, but I was extremely well impressed by the structure, the articulation, the clarity, and the choice of the case studies of your thesis. detail. I was able to find only a few typos and a few small things. I'm going to send you directly the file. You don't need to take any notes. Even minor things, thinking of also a possible general reader of your thesis on the shelves of the LDM library or online one day. Maybe in the bios I would add more clearly the 2 towns in which the workshop operated, in Amsterdam, and I really, or maybe you could move the picture. You have very articulated entries correctly stating the provenance, the state of preservation, and the attribution issues for each of your case studies, and maybe putting the photograph in the beginning, the image in the beginning of the entry, rather than at the very end, would help the general reader who may not have in mind the composition to immediately have it under his eyes or her eyes. I really liked also clearly the choice of your case studies was a result of a long research. They are not taken by chance. They have stories to tell and problems. They open problems, and even from the choice of your case studies, one can tell the research that was done prior to designing the final outline of the thesis. And it's not even easy to navigate through all those catalogs and those different groups and opinions dating back to the beginning almost of the discipline of and the foundations of art history. And it was very, very interesting also how you approached the problem of the concept of workshop, of supervision by the master, authenticity, and attribution. It just immediately recalled me an exhibit we had. I'm more into Italian Renaissance, Verrocchio and workshop, and as a master of Leonardo, and not only as a master of Leonardo, so which also was a whole exhibit at Strozzi. You may have seen it. That yes. I remember it was in your year. That's why I'm mentioning the problem of a collaborative work, which is a problem. It's but it's also an exciting scenario. And ultimately, our perception, as Catherine was saying, of an attribution is very different. We know very little on how the master would perceive and would communicate his signature and his authentic works. Ultimately, at least in the Italian Renaissance world, the master would respond and would call them all his own, absolutely, with pride, allowing space of intervention to different pupils, but it was part of the dynamics of a complex and articulated workshop with plenty of talented young collaborators and assistants. It was part of the deal. The contract would be signed by the master. He would be paid. Then he would chair, and he would even give different responsibilities. And Verrocchio in particular was extremely good in enhancing and finding a space for each of his talented pupils. So, but still, it would be a work coming out of his group of collaborators. Yes. So. Nowadays we tend to be much more inclusive when it gets to. So saying Rembrandt may be acceptable, even if it's Rembrandt and studio and workshop, because the nuances between circle of, as Catherine was saying, are really sometimes there are two, and the difference between circle, follower, school of, and I can add more of this kind of definitions. And also you approached in a very fresh, let me say, in your conclusions, they were booming conclusions. I loved the diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusive issues that you were presenting, and also very daring, and the way that transparency on attribution, accuracy on in doing justice to a scientific work or done by others maybe an option for museum, although each museum responds for. And also another thing, some of the you reported fully the site, the entries on site, sometimes of different level of accuracy. There are two sometimes entries on the site, and they're never signed. While in a catalog, in an exhibition catalog, the author of the entry takes responsibility and signs and say, hey, this is my opinion, and I'm putting my name at the end, and or also the curator ultimately of an exhibit. In a site, it could be given to interns that are trying to do justice to all the different opinions, and therefore sometimes the lack of consistency is and the lack of upper coordination among all the information provided on the site can be attributed to this to the fact that they are not signed and no one responds for, except ultimately very vaguely the museum staff for what is on the museum site. So that is certainly, there should be, as you were saying, more coordination, more control, and more consistency. You even dream of having the educators of the museum or the guides instructed coherently with the content of the updated research and ultimately site information. And that's even a step forward, but it's rather correct. Also, your idea of including the general public in the discussion, even if it's a scholarly discussion, in terms of helping to distinguish small technical differences. And that can be done, I believe, also with sharing preservation or restoration information on the painting. Because, here in Italy, restorations are the show of the museum. You see restorers there on the wall, on the painting, and their in-progress results are shared with the public, and it's part of the show. It's part of the experience of a museum, and that can add a true. It can be an added value to the visit, of course. But even learning to distinguish little details, technical details, can even help the general public to grasp, the problems of attributions as well. Let me summarize now what should be done in the next, I would say, week, in the next 7 days, if you don't mind, Hannah. Again, I was really impressed. The structure of your thesis was impeccable. I mean, I could not, it was clear, where you started from, and all the way through the development where, your conclusions. There are minor corrections, if I may use the word, suggested by Dr. Scallon with references to specific pages. And because in my understanding, you'll be receiving a file, or Catherine, thank you. So from page 14 to page 28, page 31, 57, 63, you was minor information to add or changes, while the attribution issue on page 47, how can be communicated, how can be shared at different levels, could be also an issue to approach a bit, not that it's not, but a bit more deeply, and the coordination between the object label and how it cannot, the exclusion issue, the issue of authenticity, and the curatorial discretion issue. And that is, I understand, through questions is bit left to your own reasoning to develop these points. Or, we all touched a few points, but you just need to make it bloom in your head and on the page, in a way. Also, Martha, Dr. Hollander was touching several points. For instance, the communication between educational and curatorial departments in terms of content and attributions, and the inconsistencies between the site content, the wall label, the wall text, or the different entries on the site. The mission towards the public. What kind of mission? Each museum has its own policies. It's not just a matter of money. Sometimes it's really a matter of also policies. And in your conclusion, maybe develop a bit further what else can be done, from now on to move forward. Not only institutional policies of museums, but also suggest a path of research to future researcher, whoever is interested in this specific. But thanks to a limited number of cases, you really opened a general problem, and that is a great value for a thesis, because from the micro research it goes to macro, and that was for what I'm concerned. Again, I'm not an expert, but rather impressive. May I ask, is 7 days a time, 1 week to implement this modifications suggested enough for you, Hannah? Next Friday, could you find the PDF to Martha and Catherine, or do you think you
can do that? Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think that I was probably very long, and I'm sorry, but it's minor things mostly.
Yes.
You're on the right path. Don't think it's not doable. Because then if you receive, Martha and Catherine, the PDF from Hannah in 1 week from now, 7 days from now, say next Friday, okay, next Friday afternoon before the weekend, would you be able in 1 week to evaluate and send your evaluations back to Claire Stipulowski, our administrative, secretary, and so we can process all this. And Hannah, you know very well, you need to add along with your PDF copy with all these things implemented, Form C and D, remember, partially filled in the beginning by yourself, and then you know well the procedures. So anyone from the audience would like to make questions or add observations, we're here for that. Oh. I'm waiting a while. Should any of the listeners may want to add anything. I see everything silent. So let me say it again. In 1 week from now, Hannah, the PDF to Martha and Catherine with Form C and D, partially filled, so they can evaluate. And then another week, so we're talking, I'm looking at the wall calendar. So by July 24th, then, if you can do I don't know but if you can write your evaluation, which is approximately 2 paragraphs, just to remind you, touching a number of points you'll see from the form. If you can do it and double check everything and do it by, say, early the following week, the 28th, the 29th, how does that sound? Is it doable to send back? If you don't have time, we can go all the way to July 31st, but it's a little tight for us to then process.
Okay.
So it would be ideal to receive your evaluations by July 29, 28, 29.
I can do that.
I will get it to you. I'm unavailable the 28th and 29th, so I'm going to get it to you on the 27th.
Fantastic.
Yes, that's wonderful.
Even better.
Done. Yeah.
Let me congratulate now, Hannah, for completing your Master of Arts in Music. Congratulations. Really, congratulations. And everyone is, you can see, right?
Yeah,
everyone is also participating in Okay. Catherine, was great to see you again. Martha, it was a pleasure, a true pleasure. And you work behind the scenes for one of our students. Thank you. And so I may just close